2 weeks ago, we started on a conversation about identity politics. And last week, we decided to sort of move away from that slightly, although it's all kind of interconnected, interrelated.
Very much.
But we moved away so we could talk about President Trump's Mount Rushmore speech.
Right.
I'd like to get back to that identity politics conversation. And I think last time we talked a lot about sort of the historical, philosophical, theoretical background of identity politics. We talked about Rousseau. We talked about what led up to that. But now I think there's a really important conversation to have about current politics and really the progressive movement for the last 140 years.
I have a hunch that theoretical stuff's going to creep back into our conversation.
Well, it has to, right? But if we're going to talk about current politics and if we're going to talk about identity politics in the current culture, you kind of have to start with Joe Biden's quote from about 6 weeks ago, 5-6 weeks ago, where he was on some morning TV show.
Oh, and that's right.
And he says, if you can't figure out whether or not to vote for me or Trump, you ain't black.
Well, boy, there's a lot packed into that statement. I mean, let's first peel back the hubris, the arrogance, the condescension. Set all that aside. Ultimately, this isn't about beating up on old Joe Biden. His statement, there's the core of it. If you really think through what's going on in there, I mean, what he's saying is, right, if you have experienced life as a person with dark skin, if that's your cultural, ethnic background, then there is one way to think, one way to act, one and only one choice to make. And you ain't black if you don't act that way, think that way, make that choice. It really is. It's identity politics. I'm trying to think of the best way to define. We should probably put a definition out there, right? For identity politics, it's a form of politics that assumes that there is no truth that applies to all human beings. There's no moral or political truth that applies to everyone. There's no ultimate good. The classical thinkers would talk about the summum bonum, the highest good for human beings. Right? That all human beings have certain things in common, and there are certain things that are bad for human beings. There are certain things that are good. There's a highest good. Identity politics rejects all that. It says everything about you is a function or a product of your background, your cultural background, how you grew up, your life experiences. And therefore, no one else can really know anything about that, experience anything about that. You know, I'm a scholar of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War and the fight to end slavery. And when I think about identity politics, this question comes to my mind. The question is, could Lincoln was not black and Lincoln was not a slave, yet he claimed to know that slavery was wrong. And so for modern progressives today who are just mired in identity politics, everything's about cultural groups and backgrounds. Was Lincoln lying when he said that he knew? In fact, he would demonstrate with arguments and ideas and principles why slavery was wrong.
He would demonstrate with reason.
That's right. He would use reason, and he would offer something of a syllogism, or something of a logical argument that would end in a conclusion that slavery is intrinsically wrong. So was he lying, or was he deceiving himself? Was he just a fool to think that he could actually know what's right and wrong for people with different color skin? Because the slaves, virtually all of them, they looked very different than Lincoln looked. You know, if we have listeners right now thinking, well, that's just silly. Of course, everyone knows that slavery is wrong. Of course, Lincoln could know, and all of us can know that slavery is wrong. Yet we talk today as if Lincoln couldn't know. I remember back when President Obama was in office and there was an opening on the Supreme Court. He actually made a big deal about what we most need on the court is a Latina woman to represent that cultural perspective. And there I was watching that unfold thinking, I just kind of want a constitutionalist. I don't care if it's a man or a woman, or I don't care anything about what color skin they have or the cultural background. I just want someone who's actually read and understands and wants to uphold the Constitution. And then when you really pull in that thread, right, you trot out, think of some of the more problematic parts of the parts of the Constitution that have been used and abused and twisted and stretched beyond any semblance of what it originally meant. Things like the Commerce Clause, which are now, it's used to justify basically anything Congress wants to do. They say,
right,
that's our Commerce Clause power. So growing up as a Latina woman, how does that influence her reading of the Commerce Clause, right? What does that mean in terms of constitutional jurisprudence? When you really boil this subject down, this whole notion of identity politics, and that what matters most is the color of your skin or your sexual preferences or peccadillos or the language you speak or the religion, and we've even enshrined that into our laws now in all kinds of ways. Think of every form where we have the little boxes. You and I have talked about this before, right? And there's always 5, 6, 7 boxes. Are you Hispanic? Even though there's no country called Hispania, so far as I know. Are you African American, right? Are you a woman? And why do those boxes exist? Those boxes exist because the laws and the regulations around the laws say you're going to be treated differently depending on which box that you check.
And to that point, we've had a lot of conversations over just this election cycle about people who have abused those boxes, people who have claimed to be of other cultures, right? You had Beto O'Rourke, who tried to pass off essentially as Hispanic Latino, when it was just a nickname. He's a white guy from Texas,
right?
But he uses that nickname because it made people think, and we had Elizabeth Warren using those boxes, checking that she was Native American or Indian, as we've been taught to use.
And what is she, like one part out of thousands?
Over 1,000, yeah,
right.
And she was brought up, and you know what, it doesn't really matter to me if she was brought up being told that's what she was, and she thought that's what she was, and she didn't do it to purposely abuse the system. But it does say something that she thought it was worthwhile, right? For all of the talk of white privilege, for all of the talk of we need to participate in all these identity politics issues, and we need to make laws to protect people and minorities and everything else, she thought it was worthwhile for her to sit back and say, I'm going to check that box that says I'm an American Indian.
She thought it was important, and I just want to be clear, so did the people who made the forms. Right. Think of the bureaucrats sitting in some room kind of like this around a conference table, and they're the ones who actually designed the forms, and they talk back and forth who should get a box and who doesn't get a box. They think it's important because the Congress and the state legislatures that pass the laws think that these things are important. And when you really keep pulling on this thread, suppose, Dave, you and I agree. We say, look, there is no truth that applies to all human beings, certainly no moral or political truth. There are just different points of view, just different perspectives.
It's quite the fantasy world you're talking about, but I'll go with you for the moment.
And we agree to this. And so if someone says, I grew up an Indian, then the only way to possibly understand what that person has experienced and how they think is to also be an Indian or a black person or a woman or any other group. And we agree, and we decide we arrange all these laws. We decide certain groups have suffered more, so they're going to get some subsidies. They're going to get some perks. Maybe we'll add a few points to their ACT and SAT scores when they're trying to get into college. And other groups, they've done too well. We're going to take a little more away from them. We'll engage in some progressive taxation, and we'll tax more the people who are in the groups that have prospered more in the past, not been victimized. And we agree to all this. And then along comes Rachel Dolezal, who was the head of the, was it the NAACP, I think?
I think so.
And this is a very pasty white woman who goes to incredible lengths of making her skin look darker, doing her hair the way many black women do their hair, and all that. And the important point is she says, I'm black. and I want to be treated as a black person, and she gets called on it. People figure out you're not actually black. You got pasty white skin. You see pictures of her as a child. I mean, she's this blue-eyed, white, right, little girl. And what's fascinating is her response. Her response was, being black is a state of mind. It doesn't have anything to do. It doesn't matter what hue exactly my skin color is. And we live in a world today where that idea that your being, including things like your gender, right, is not some objective quality that can be observed and determined by others. It's an opinion. It's an attitude. It's a state of mind. It's fluid. It can change. At that point, we're in a kind of cultural, that's a form of cultural and political nihilism at that point. I mean, there's nothing meaningful in that when we say everything hinges on cultural background, ethnic background, and then we say, and even those things are subjective. It really depends on how a person feels.
Well, and I don't understand. She had a lot of defenders, right? She had a lot of people she worked with at the NAACP. She had a lot of people in the black community defending her, saying this. And what I don't understand how they got to that point is we have groups out there saying you can't know what we went through unless you walk down the street every day as a black man or woman. Right? You can't possibly know what that experience is like. But Rachel Dolezal can because she thinks she's black, but nobody saw her that way, right? So she had a childhood where nobody saw her as black. So if I have to experience that life to actually understand, then how can I also support somebody who didn't walk in those shoes, didn't have that experience, but just claim to, I have a strong connection to that race, and therefore I'm going to identify that way.
And contrast, so that view of identity politics, where the idea is we can only relate to others basically like us. If we haven't walked in their shoes, then we can't know anything, not anything meaningful, nothing important about others. Contrast that with this incredible history we have in our own United States. I mentioned one example before, a white Abraham Lincoln going to extraordinary lengths, ultimately loses his life in the fight to end black slavery, the legal enslavement of black people. I would look at that and I'd say, good job, Abe. You did the right thing. And it wasn't because he was black. It wasn't because he lived the experience. He looked at that and he saw the intrinsic injustice of it. Going back even earlier, the time of our founding, there's an incredible episode. I don't know how widely it's known. The first president of the United States, George Washington, when he was elected the first time, there was a small Hebrew congregation, a group of Jews in Newport, Rhode Island.
Right.
And they wrote him this very beautiful, simple little letter congratulating him, offering the new president blessings and prayers for the new country. And he responded. And the response is, it's one of the most striking documents in history. He reciprocates their prayers, offers good things, blessings for them, and he welcomes them as fellow citizens. He addresses them as fellow citizens. And he makes clear in that document, he says, here in the United States, we no longer talk about religious toleration as if there's some ruling group who decides what they'll tolerate and what they don't tolerate, right? I mean, toleration is really it's a synonym for permission. To tolerate is to give someone permission. He says, no, here we actually recognize the individual natural rights, which include the natural right to worship freely. You have a natural, inherent right as a human being, and our laws are going to protect that right. You worship however you want to worship.
And that even went beyond just worship how you want to worship. He actually said in there, you are entitled to all of the natural rights that every other human being and every other citizen has shared. And that's a letter I read on an annual basis and I share with friends and family. And when I think about that letter, it's the first time in the history of the world, that somebody had said to a group of Jewish people, You are citizens.
Well, not
You
just
are
somebody.
the president of the United States.
Well, the chief executive
Right.
of a government.
Right.
I mean, in the ancient world, it would be as if, a Caesar or a king or an emperor or a pharaoh addressed a group of Jews as full equal citizens. And you're right, it had never been done. And here's the striking thing. George Washington was no Jew.
Right. Right.
And yet he understood that even though they have a different, religious background, ethnic background, these are human beings who have the same intrinsic natural freedom as everybody else.
It's something where he demonstrated an understanding in just a few short words. I mean, this wasn't a long letter, but like you said, it was a beautiful letter.
Yeah.
And in just a few short words, he demonstrated an understanding of the path that the Jews had walked for thousands of years through different experiences, whether we go back to ancient Egypt or we go into what had just recently started happening in France and Germany as Napoleon's reign started coming to an end and what had happened with Charlemagne. He showed this whole understanding in just a few short words.
Right.
Even though he didn't experience it, he didn't have anything else. And to that point, when you started talking about Lincoln, the first thing that came to my mind was, what would Frederick Douglass have said? Mm-hmm. Frederick Douglass, a black man, would he have said, Lincoln, you can't possibly understand what we have gone through as slaves?
In fact, Frederick Douglass is fascinating because as a young man, he's born into this miserable state of slavery. He escapes, he runs away, changes his name, and he eventually connects with William Lloyd Garrison, who's a white man. He has launched a newspaper. Garrison's a very gifted writer, editor. He coaches, he tutors Frederick Douglass, helps him practice writing and getting better. And there's one dynamic of the relationship that's utterly fascinating. William Lloyd Garrison, this white man, this abolitionist, was convinced throughout his lifetime that the United States Constitution was fundamentally immoral. He once called it a covenant with hell, with the devil, that because it made compromises with slavery, it allowed slavery to exist. So from Garrison's point of view, the most important thing to do was to get rid of the Constitution, abolish it, replace it. Black Frederick Douglass starts studying the Constitution. Douglass is an incredible constitutional thinker.
Sure.
He disagreed with his mentor. He came away, he said, "You're wrong." He said, you Garrison, you're actually making the argument many Southerners are making. All these pro-slavery people are saying that the Constitution protects slavery. The Constitution is pro-slavery. Black Frederick Douglass says, you're all wrong. The Constitution, he called it a glorious liberty document. He said he made a huge deal of the fact that words like slave and slavery never appear in there. He said the whole design is looking forward to a future where there is no slavery. And when every state has abolished slavery, he pointed this out. I learned this from Frederick Douglass. When every state abolished slavery on their own, if that had happened, not one word of the Constitution needed to be changed. Even things like the famous 3/5 clause, which applies to, it says we're going to count all the free persons and 3/5 of all other persons. Well, if there are free persons, the other persons are unfree, are slaves. But if there are no slaves, then we're not counting 3/5 of anybody. We're just counting all the free persons. So he was able to think way outside his cultural box. He was able to look at something objectively. And where all this points, I want to go in a little heady, back to our theoretical discussions just a little bit, because this is what's ultimately at stake, is the very concept of truth about human things. Is that possible or not? Today, the view of identity politics is we can't really understand each other. We can't really even have a meaningful conversation if we come from different backgrounds, if we have different color skin, if we have different life experiences. Now, have that in your mind. I want our audience to be thinking of that identity politics view and just consider the classical view. The classical view, we find this in We have Aristotle up here. There's Aristotle right there on the end.
Actually, we have here and
we have a couple
basic
of
works.
There we go. That's good that Aristotle's well represented. So Aristotle looks at the human being without any regard to things like skin color, right? Just the human being. And one of the first observations he makes, he says a human being is a compound being. Every human being.
Mm-hmm.
A human being is part physical material, bone, hair, skin, blood, all the matter of us, and there's an immaterial part. He called it the soul. Some modern thinkers call it the mind, but it's that part of us that is free to make choices.
Mm-hmm.
Now that basic dichotomy, that there's a material part to our being and an immaterial part, is that just the view of a white dude? Is that just the prejudice of a Greek? Right?
Right.
Do I have to be a Greek to be able to understand that? Or did he actually discern something true about all human beings? I think he discerned something true. And then he goes on from there. And he says, now if you look at the soul part of the human being, there's a hierarchy. There are different parts of the soul. There are kind of animal parts, the instincts, when you go long enough without eating, what happens? You get hungry, right? And if you feel your stomach start growling, you start thinking about food. If you go too long without sleeping, you get tired. You start to desire, you want to close your eyes, you want to put your head down, you want to go to sleep. So we have these appetites, we have these desires for various things, like other animals do. But then there's something higher in the human soul. He called it reason. He called it logos.
Right.
It's this thing, it's this capacity to actually think about our appetites, our own appetites, and decide whether to indulge them or not, or how to indulge them, or when to. Think of what it means to go on a diet. What does it mean to go on a diet? It means
depriving yourself of certain appetites.
Yeah, you want to eat more, but you're using your reason. You're saying, hold on, chubby, your pants are getting a little too tight. You gotta start eating a little less. And there are those different parts of the soul, right? On full display. Aristotle was right. Now, from that, he builds a comprehensive view of human life, of the good life. He makes it clear that the highest thing that all human beings ultimately want is happiness. They're all reaching for happiness. The problem is they make lots of bad choices on their way to, they don't fully understand what happiness is.
Out of passion and instinct.
That's right. And so there's so much there to learn for any human being, coming from any background, in any history. It doesn't matter if you're living in the ancient world or the medieval world or in the modern progressive world. Those are truths. Those are eternal, immutable truths about human beings. Our own founders added their own insights and said every human being, no matter where they live, whether they're rich or poor, whether it doesn't matter, whether they're suffering injustices or not, they have a natural right to their own freedom, to their own property. That's a universal truth, and we should try to make our laws align with that truth. We should get as close as we possibly can to it. That's the core concept of Western civilization. That's the core concept of the United States. And we're at a great danger right now in losing all that with this intellectually bankrupt view that everything about us is confined to our cultural or ethnic background.
Well, and let's be clear about why those are truths and why those are such a foundational aspect. They're truths because they are a function or a result of reasonable thought, of reasoning through a conversation and saying, going through the steps to determine, okay, we do have these inalienable natural rights that we are born with. They are not given to us by a politician. They're not given to us by a bureaucrat or a judge. We are born with them. They are given to us at birth. And that takes reason to get to that. And then we also have to remember that should be, as Aristotle pointed out and as our founders tried to follow, that should also be the foundation of all of our laws, right? If you can agree that all human beings have the same rights, we can reason to the same conclusion for all people,
right,
then you get a viable, reasonable law.
You have a foundation there for something good. Aristotle, by the way, you're absolutely right. He once remarked, he was talking about the importance of the rule of law, having laws ultimately rule in a political sense rather than individuals, because individuals are fickle. They change their minds. You can't predict anything. Whereas if you have a law that's stable, you know what the laws means today, tomorrow, next week, next year. You can plan for things. And that leads him into a discussion about what law really is. And he has this very interesting definition of law. The way Aristotle defines law, he says law is reason without passion, without emotion. So when you have any laws anything that claims to be a law or is presented as a law that is unreasonable, that is unjust, that arbitrarily divides people into groups and treats one group poorly and treats another group well, that kind of unjust, unreasonable law really isn't a law in Aristotle's strict definition of it. And this is where we are. I mean, we're in a fight to save the authority of reason in human interactions, in human life, this thing that for thousands of years people just kind of took for granted, that yes, reason is part of our nature, we should use reason. Some people don't use it very well. We want to cultivate it and practice reasoning, just like throwing a baseball or a football or shooting basketball into a hoop. Reasoning requires practice. It is really easy to make mistakes in our reasoning, and yet we're in a world today where that's rejected in the name of individual passions, individual experiences, cultural backgrounds. And I guess here's the other big point I want to make. And it has led to this great confusion. That identity politics, we see it, we hear it, it's infused into our laws and our policies, and yet everyone knows, they really do know, that there are universal truths. Aristotle made the point, everyone needs friends. Every human being. Some people like to have more friends. Some people like to have fewer friends. But nobody wants to be friendless. Nobody wants to be a person who has not one friend in the world. And he points out, if you treat your friends poorly, if you lie to your friends and cheat from your friends, you're going to be friendless. You're going to be a very unhappy person. Right. Now, that's a universal truth, and it doesn't matter if you have black skin, white skin, green, purple, yellow, right? It doesn't matter. It's true for everyone. If you are productive and entrepreneurial and you want to start a business, you want to run a business, and you lie to and cheat from your customers, your business venture isn't going to go very well, right? You're going to be miserable.
Or even if you're not an entrepreneur, if you just have a job, but you consistently lie and cheat at your job and to your boss, you're going to continuously get fired. You're going to continuously be looking for another job. Let's take a step back real quick, though, because you touched on two different points there. And one of them in your first point was really, really important. And I want to make sure everybody got a good grasp on that. And that is Aristotle's comment that law is reason without passion. Yeah. And you talked about passion being fickle, or people being fickle when it comes to their passions and what's important to them. There has been no greater demonstration of that than the experience of the United States over the last 244 years, right? You have, for a time, a lot of people, a significant portion of the United States was passionate that slavery should exist. Yeah. Didn't make it right, but that was passion getting in the way of reason. We know through reason that slavery is wrong. You can go all the way through, and if we started this conversation talking about Joe Biden, if you look at Joe Biden's 40-year career, he has responded to passions over reason in almost every law he's introduced into the lexicon, right?
You're right about that.
Every single time.
Yeah, in fact, he has helped to infuse the concepts of identity politics actually into policy, actually into law. He's been a supporter, the whole regime or structure of affirmative action, the whole idea of keeping track of who has which skin color and which gender and so on and so forth, and then offering different perks, different favors, different goodies, different subsidies to some, putting special burdens on others. That's been his career. And I think that's what he meant when he said, if you don't know you're supposed to vote for me, you ain't black. What he's saying is, I've been offering you you certain people, right, you black people, I've been offering you free stuff. And if you don't know that you're supposed to vote for me, then you ain't black because you don't appreciate the free stuff. Well, what if you're a black man or a black woman? You say, I don't want your free stuff. I don't want any special treatment. I want equal protection for my freedom and my property that is extended to all my fellow citizens.
Right.
Then you would be a black man or a black woman who likely would not vote for Joe Biden.
And how can he say that if he truly believes in what he's saying? He hasn't walked in the shoes of a black man.
Right.
He can't possibly know what their experience is and what they want, what their passions are, what their needs are, other than what he's guessing.
Right. Or
he can use reason to create laws. And we've talked about this before, and this is a big one for me right now, and it's something we've been talking a lot about is that 1994 crime bill that he authored, right? That was we need to protect black communities by locking up black people who are bad.
Right.
And there was no reason around that. It was passion. It was, we have this demand.
It was an irrational prejudice, right?
Sure.
It was racism. Bottom line, it was racism.
Line. You're right. And he just said, I'm being demanded. There is a mob of people out there. We've talked about mobs before when we talked about Seattle. There is a mob of people out there demanding action.
Yep.
And that's their passion. They are acting out of passion, out of emotion, because they strongly want something.
And then what they do, so the whole war on drugs, what it really has been an effort to lock up large numbers of young black men. That's what has been a reality. But it's never marketed that way. It's always marketed as tough on crime. I'm tough on crime. I'm a law and order guy. That's the way Biden defended that. You know, there are other. I mean, this whole idea of identity politics. I mean, it is like it's like an intellectual cancer with tentacles that reach out thousands of different directions, and it spoils everything that it touches. The Supreme Court handed down a case 3 weeks ago, a highly controversial split decision. And what the court argued, there's a part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which I actually think is blatantly unconstitutional. So did Barry Goldwater. He opposed it when he was in the United States Senate. What it says is that an employer, a business owner, shall not discriminate against certain classes of people, including based on skin color, based on race, based on gender, based on sex. So you can't. And now there are all kinds of problems with the law itself, because first of all, it raises the question: what rightful power does the government have to come and tell any business owner to whom they must offer jobs or must not refuse jobs, or right when they can fire somebody? A job should be simply an agreement between two people who voluntarily agree on something.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, and if one of them doesn't like what the other's offering, don't accept the deal. Go start your own business if you want to. But what the court did is they added to, so that law has given rise to all these special protected classes. Now that doesn't include all citizens. It's only citizens who are part of these groups, these identity groups that politicians say have been unfairly subjected and victimized in history. And what the court did is they added sexual orientation and also transsexualism. So people who want to pretend that they're different, sex than right. how they're born. These are now protected classes. And think of what that means. Think of how here's the connection between identity politics and big unconstitutional government. So a business owner, those of you listening out there right now who are business owners, imagine the scenario. You hire somebody and they're not very good, and they're not adding much value to your business, and so you decide you have to let that person go. And that person is a transsexual, or that person is a homosexual. And that person says, you just fired me because of my transsexualism or because of my homosexuality. And the business owner says, no, I fired you because you suck as an employee. You're not helping my business, and this is my life. I've invested my life, my capital, my blood and sweat and tears into making this business go, and you're bad for it. That's why I'm letting you go. Well, imagine that disgruntled former employee wants to go file a lawsuit and say, look, the Supreme Court ruled on behalf of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that I cannot be fired because of my sexuality. Well, who's going to handle that lawsuit? Where's it going to be filed? There needs to be all kinds of bureaucrats at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, right, to enforce these things. You need bureaucrats at the Civil Rights Commission to hear these complaints. You need federal judges with big staffs, right, to hear these cases. So all these things trying to micromanage and centrally plan how people are going to make decisions, who they want to interact with, what kind of exchanges and trades and agreements they're going to make, requires an army of bureaucrats to enforce all that. And that's how identity politics feeds right into the growing bureaucratic state we see all around us.
Let's follow that whole chain of dominoes, right? You now know that based on everything you just said, if I hire somebody who's homosexual or transsexual or any other protected class of people, right? We use those two as an example, but any other protected class of people, if you hire them and they don't work out and you fire them, you might get sued.
There's a risk.
So what are you going to do? You're not going to hire them.
Right.
You're going to start taking that into consideration.
And let's be real clear. You're not going to hire them not because you're a hater, not because you're a racist. You're not going to not hire them because it's additional risk.
It's fear.
Why would you take on additional risk when you could hire someone else who's just as good, who's lower risk? It's less likely you'll be sued.
Right. So we're going to go through a period where you're going to start seeing fewer of those people hired for jobs, fewer of any protected class of people hired for jobs. When that happens, you're going to see the passion of the mob change. And the first step is going to be, it's almost like the 5 stages of grief in a way, right? You're not just going to say, okay, that was a bad idea. Let's try a different way to fix this.
Right.
You're going to say, now we want to require you to have a certain number of people of protected classes in your company, which we're already seeing, right? So the protected classes are at varying stages of their protection.
That's right.
Right? So now we're hearing you have to have in California a certain number of women on your board of directors. Right? And I actually had a conversation last night with one of our guardians who is a female entrepreneur who is so smart and so talented and so capable and has built an incredible technology company, software company here in Denver. And at the same time, she's sitting there thinking, I want people to recognize me for what I've accomplished.
Right.
Not for, oh, she's a woman, so she was given special privileges.
No, you're absolutely right. The whole affirmative action regime undermines the respect that should be due for real accomplishment.
So then what happens is you start forcing people by state, right? California says you have to have a certain number of women on your board. And then eventually they start saying you have to have a certain number of each protected class on your board.
And it involves timetables and quotas, right? The government comes in and says, you have this long to hit these quotas, you have to, in terms of your employees and board members and everything else. And we're going to tell you the racial and gender composition of your business.
And the alternative is what?
Freedom.
Well, you leave the state.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
Right?
Yeah. When it's
you still have that choice.
Right.
And we are seeing major companies leaving California as an example.
That's right.
We've seen major companies move offshore. There has been this whole movement of, this was a reaction to our corporate tax rates.
Right.
But we saw all of these tech companies open their quote unquote corporate headquarters in Ireland, where the tax rate was 3.5%, where the corporate tax rate was 3.5%, as opposed to 35% in the United States, and they just leave all their money overseas, right? All the money they'd make in China, all the money they'd make in Europe and Asia, it would all just go into Ireland, and they would keep their capital there. The jobs would stay there, where they're not getting all these regulations. And then it hurts our economy in the long term. It hurts our businesses in the long term. It hurts our innovation in the long term.
Yep.
We don't progress as a society.
Yep. We don't create wealth. We don't prosper. You're absolutely right. And the alternative to all that, right, is freedom, meaning basically leave people alone. If someone's trying to make it go running a business, you and I know this, running a business, it's a hard thing. It's a risky thing. We face new challenges every day that we didn't expect or anticipate. Leave business owners alone, leave property owners alone, let them make their agreements. And if someone doesn't like a certain job offer or the way, decline it, refuse it. There's another way that this whole realm of identity politics feeds into the big, what I sometimes like to call the regulatory subsidy state. That's what our government really has become. It controls and regulates, and it subsidizes. It takes from some people and puts some in their own pockets, the bureaucrats do, and the politicians, and then subsidizes friends and others they need to buy favors from. We were talking about women. The court is just wrapping up a very active end of its session, its 2020 session. Many decisions have come down in the last few weeks. And one of them, I actually posted about this on social media, the court struck down one little part of an Obamacare regulation that required businesses to provide contraception to women employees, not to men, which is sort of curious.
Right.
Because the last time I checked, I think it takes both parts to make babies. And the headlines in the New York Times, the headlines was that hundreds of thousands of women are no longer going to have access to birth control because of what the Supreme Court just took it away. and I thought, what would be a much more honest way to describe it would say thousands of business owners now have slightly more freedom to choose what to offer to their employees. If they want to offer paying for someone's birth control, they can offer, and if they don't want to, they don't have to. But here's the connection between identity politics and big government. So we say, okay, we're just going to assume all of them want birth control.
Right.
And why should they have to pay for their own birth control? Let's say they're entitled to it. They're entitled to birth control. Therefore, somebody else needs to subsidize it. Somebody else needs to fund it. So let's pass a law and let's require business owners and say, you must pay for these things. It doesn't matter if the woman you're hiring doesn't want it. It doesn't matter if you don't want to offer it. You must do this. And so it's government taking control of other people's property, deciding how it's going to be spent. What about the old view of, if you're a woman, first of all, why don't you just go negotiate and try to get the best paying job you can? And if you're not happy with what others are willing to pay you, improve your skills, learn a new talent, to become more valuable. As you become more valuable, then other people will be willing to pay you more. And if you want someone else to subsidize your birth control, put that in your offer. Say, I'm willing to do this amount of work for this kind of compensation, and you pay for my birth control. Right? And have those negotiations. That's the way free people actually make these decisions. But instead, we start with this premise of identity politics. Certain groups need certain things, are entitled to certain things, and then we use government to subsidize what we say they're entitled to.
Well, and even worse, I say we start with the assumption. Under identity politics, there is the assumption that certain groups aren't capable of getting something. And it's a fundamentally racist, unreasonable response, because you can look at any group of people anywhere, and there are people who have come from the worst circumstances you could possibly imagine, who have done amazing things to change our world for the better. And that's something to be encouraged, and that's something to be honored and respected.
In fact, this is a good way to circle back, and maybe we'll close up on this note. We've been talking about universal truths. We've referenced Aristotle several times and the founders. Here's another universal human truth. Any human being can create wealth. Any human being. Wealth is not this fixed stuff out there and only a few people get lots of it, many people. No, any human being can create wealth. The key is, I shouldn't say it's no secret. The key is to do something other people value. Mm-hmm. Stop paying attention to yourself. Look around the people around you. What do they want? What do other people value? What do they appreciate? What are they willing to purchase? and then produce or supply, create the things that other people want. That's how you create wealth for yourself, is by creating value for others, so long as you're protected in what you create. People who aren't protected, people whose property is not secure, they're not very inclined to be very entrepreneurial. They don't create a lot of value because they're worried somebody's going to come and take whatever they create,
Right.
which tells us something important about what government should be doing. Instead of engaged in all this identity politics, instead of dividing citizens into groups and offering special perks and favors to some and then saying you ain't black if you don't vote for this perk, rather than that, reject all that. And instead, let's look at our government and say, why don't you protect the personal freedom and the personal property of each and every citizen? And that way, citizens are secure. Those who want more out of life, be as productive as you want to be. Create value for others. There's a universal truth that stands in direct contradiction to this whole notion of identity politics.
And through reason, anybody can create value.
That's right.
Right? Anybody who takes the time to reason through something, they can create value. And it doesn't matter what your background is, what doesn't matter anything else. We're all empowered with that capability. It's innate in humans.
It requires this thing, looking at others and actually paying attention to others, which can you see how that just flies in the face of the whole notion of identity politics? Identity politics is basically a form of woe is me. Woe is me because I'm part of this group and this group has been victimized. Whereas wealth creation says, stop thinking about yourself so much. Look around the people around you. Who cares if they have the same skin color as you or not? Who cares if they have the same sexual preferences or not? What do they want? What do they need? What do they value? If you can supply what they value, you're creating wealth for yourself. You're making a better life for yourself and your loved ones.
Right. Well, I think that is the point to wrap on, and I think if we got anything through to people, it's this idea that if we can return to creating laws that are reason without passion, that are universally applicable, we're all going to be a whole lot better off. We're all going to be a whole lot more free, and we're going to have more ability and more potential, and there's going to be a lot more opportunities for people to grow.
Freedom rests on a foundation of reason. Rejecting reason, rejecting universal human truths, leads us down the path of identity politics, which leads to sprawling, massive, progressive, unconstitutional government, to a gigantic regulatory subsidy state in which we basically have to get on our knees and ask permission from those in government before we do anything. The contrast couldn't be stronger, and that's why we need guardians of reason, guardians of freedom, guardians of the American idea. It's why we are no sumos custodes.
Look forward to next week.
All right.